Greetings, this is Greg. 1967 was a pretty important year for muscle cars. On one hand, it was the last year with the more traditional mid-60s body styles. Every 1967 muscle car looks very much like its 1966 counterpart, but would then be completely restyled for 1968. So the 67 cars were the last ones with what I'll call the more traditional muscle car look. On the technical side, a lot happened for the 1967 model year. First of all, every US car in 67 came equipped with a dual master cylinder for the brakes. The importance of this change can't really be overstated. It was a big deal. Now, a leak in the hydraulic brakes didn't mean you lost all normal braking. Half of the system would still work, plus of course you still had the emergency brake. It's amazing to me that it took until 1967 for this to happen. Next, front disc brakes became optional on every 1967 muscle car, and by that I mean muscle car by the traditional definition as described at the beginning of this series in the 1964 episode. Disc brakes gave the American muscle cars brakes that put their stopping power on par with the European sedans, even in some cases the better European performance sedans. This was a great option. However, most buyers didn't select it and stuck with the four-wheel drums, which was a shame. The disc brakes were far superior. There were two things the American public was pretty slow to pick up on in terms of performance automobiles. These were disc brakes and radial tires, and the reasons for this could be a video all on its own. The third big update for 67 affected the General Motors cars. In the previous years, if you bought a GM muscle car with an automatic, meaning a Chevelle SS396, Pontiac GTO, Oldsmobile 442, or a Buick Grand Sport, you had to get a 2-speed automatic. That meant your new GTO would get sand kicked in its face by every Ford Fairlane GTA or 383 powered Plymouth Satellite because those cars had 3-speed automatics. In 1967, that's no longer the case, as the GM muscle cars could now be had with 3-speed automatic transmissions which were every bit as good as the ones used for Ford, Dodge, and Plymouth. Let's dive right into the 1967 cars, starting with the Chevrolet Chevelle SS396. Compared to the previous year, the car has some minor styling updates. Overall, it looks much the same as the 1966 model, but most of the body panels were slightly different for 67, including the hood, deck lid, the fenders, bumpers, grille, taillights, and more. The engine options were pretty much the same as the previous year. The standard engine was Chevy's 396 cubic inch big block with 325 horsepower. For a small extra charge, this could be optioned up to a 350 horsepower version. The previous year's 375 horsepower option was missing from the engine lineup at the start of the model year but reappeared later. However, it was not commonly seen in the sales literature and very few people knew about the 375 horsepower option and fewer still ordered it. The 396 was arguably the best commonly produced 1960s muscle car engine. I say commonly produced because while I think, as an example, Chrysler's 426 Hemi was better, that was a very rare engine and a very expensive option. By comparison, Chevy's 396 engines were common and inexpensive while being nearly as good as the mighty Hemi. The 396 had large canted valves and excellent intake and exhaust ports. This was a very popular engine with hot rodders, still is. It was an inexpensive option on a variety of cars, thus the engines were in good supply. More importantly, without too much money, someone could add a hotter camshaft, headers, rejet the carb, and work on the ignition timing, and get these things up over 400 horsepower in a weekend. Even 500 horsepower was realistically attainable from these engines. Although the 396 was pretty much the same as the previous year, the optional 3-speed automatic transmission was new. Finally, in 67, you could buy a Chevelle with a big block, and selecting an automatic didn't mean you would lose to that Ford Fairlane GTA in the Stoplight Grand Prix. Of course, there were other transmissions available besides the 3-speed Hydra-Matic. the old 2-speed Power Glide could still be optioned in. There were a few reasons buyers would do that. First, the 2-speed transmission was less expensive, so if for some reason you wanted an SS396 but didn't care all that much about performance, then the 2-speed might make sense. Second, there are some very specific situations where the Power Glide offered performance advantages. It required less power to drive than the 3-speed, thus gave more power to the wheels. So if you were driving or racing within a very narrow speed range where you wouldn't need 3 gears, then the 2-speed could be the way to go. However, in practical terms, for almost everyone, the 3-speed was far superior. Several manual transmissions were available as well. The standard 3-speed and a pair of 4-speeds. One was a wide ratio 4-speed, and if the 350 or 375 horsepower engines were selected, you could opt for a close ratio 4-speed. The SS396 was an excellent muscle car at a great price. It was built on a great chassis, had a good suspension, and if combined with the optional 4-speed manual and disc brakes, it was a very good all-around performance car, able to win at the drag races on Saturdays against most other muscle cars, and run with the European sedans on windy roads. Next up, I want to talk about Plymouth, because this was the division of Chrysler Corporation that was aimed right at Chevrolet, and to some extent, right at the entire performance market. As I discussed in the previous episode, Plymouth in 1966 offered the Belvedere and Satellite with options that made them into pretty darn good muscle cars in all but name. In other words, they had all the makings of a muscle car in mechanical terms, but no specific muscle car branding. For 1967, the Belvedere and Satellite were largely unchanged as compared with the 1966 cars. On that subject, the Belvedere and Satellite are essentially the same car, just different trim levels. Notice, though, that the two-door Belvedere has a different roofline than the two-door Belvedere 2. In other words, Belvedere 1 and Belvedere 2 had different rooflines. But in terms of performance options, these cars are the same. I'll use the term Satellite and Belvedere somewhat interchangeably in this video just to keep it simple. For 1967, you could still order a Satellite with a 383 4-barrel, a 4-speed, or the very good Torque Flight automatic 3-speed. Various axle ratios were offered, with 3.55 to 1 being the hottest factory setup for drag racing. However, there was a laundry list of dealer-installed options, and you could take delivery of a fairly hot 383 Satellite with gear ratios all the way up to 4.89 to 1, which would be useless for anything other than the quarter mile. Actually, it's a little short even for the quarter mile. The 383 is one of my favorite engines. It's not as good in terms of performance as the Chevrolet 396. It doesn't have canted valves, fantastic ports, or 4-bolt main bearing caps like the SS396's engine. What the 383 does have is a simplistic and rugged nature that I find appealing. It also had a low price point. The Performance 383 put out 335 horsepower. It featured a 4-barrel carb sitting under a big dual snorkel air cleaner. Internally, it had 10 to 1 compression pistons, forged connecting rods, and a forged crankshaft. Although it doesn't have a 4-bolt main, the architecture of the 383 block was such that it was very strong. So strong, in fact, that you could run a supercharger or nitrous on these things up to around 600 horsepower, and as long as you didn't get any knock, and that was the real trick, but as long as you didn't get any knock, the engines would hold up for a long time. They would withstand that power. It's hard to find specific pricing for some of the 1967 cars, but it looks to me like the budget performance king for 67 would be to get a Belvedere, since it's the lower cost model, option in the 4-barrel 383 with a 4-speed, then go with a dealer-installed solid lifter street cam with associated valve gear, and a 391 differential with positraction, which Plymouth called Sure Grip. Now, the big news for 67 was the new Plymouth GTX. This was Plymouth's first true muscle car using the traditional definition. Yes, you could option a fast Belvedere or some other cars in the previous years, And in 66, you could even order the 426 Hemi in your Belvedere, but it wasn't branded as a separate car. You just had a Belvedere with a few performance options on it. Nobody would really notice unless they were a fellow enthusiast who knew what to look for. For 1967, the Plymouth GTX changes all that. It's a full-on muscle car with everything that makes it a muscle car as a standard feature. There was no weak-kneed version of the GTX for 67. It's an intermediate car, which is what we would later call mid-size. It packs the most powerful engine options Plymouth had, backed by the strongest transmissions, upgraded brakes, upgraded suspension, and an appearance package to set it apart from the lesser models. No longer did customers have to choose between the 383, which wasn't quite competitive with the Chevy 396. It was close, and with the dealer-installed mods could be faster than a base SS 396. But apples to apples, the SS 396 would beat a 383 Belvedere more often than not. Of course, the Belvedere buyer could option in the 426 Hemi and outrun about everybody else, but that was such an expensive option it was out of reach for most buyers. The obvious solution for Plymouth was to shove in their 440 cubic inch big block, which is exactly what they did. The 440 was the standard engine for the GTX. This gave it a 40 cubic inch or about 10% advantage over the competition from General Motors. The 440 was basically the same engine as the 383 but scaled up a bit. It had a larger bore and stroke, the block has a taller deck to accommodate the changes, it had 10-to-1 compression, enough to require premium fuel, but not so much that it was picky about just what premium fuel you used. Up top it had big valves, slightly larger than those in the SS 396. The 440 was a monster, rated at 375 horsepower and 490 foot-pounds of torque. Most Chevelle SS 396s were either 325 or 350 horsepower, well below the 440. There were a few SS 396s with the 375 horsepower engine, but those were rare, expensive, had solid lifters, and 11-to-1 compression, requiring pretty careful selection of fuel. Of course, none of the 396s could come close to the 440's 490 foot-pounds of torque, and the 440 was loafing to make this power with its hydraulic lifters, mildly hot cam and compression. Furthermore, I have to stress that the 440 was the standard engine in the GTX. There's no need to cherry pick rare examples of this car. They all had at least the 440 with 375 horsepower and 490 pounds of torque. As with the 383, more power could be had with the dealer-installed cam and valve train options. They even offered a dual 4-barrel carb option on the 440, although I have never seen one so equipped. My understanding is that its manifold was a poor design, and thus the dual 4-barrel 440s never really took off, no pun intended. The standard transmission was the excellent 3-speed automatic TorqueFlite 727. I love this transmission. It's very rugged, shifts smoothly in normal driving, but really grabs the next gear hard when shifted at full throttle. And this was all done mechanically. There were no electronic controls on this transmission. Of course, there was an optional 4-speed manual, which was quite good as well. Externally, nobody would mistake a Plymouth GTX for a run-of-the-mill satellite. Those hood scoops are fake, and based on the internal structure of the hood, I don't think Plymouth ever intended them to become functional. However, they served as a sign of things to come in future model years. The GTX wasn't all show and go. It had a serious performance package and large for the time 4-wheel drum brakes as standard. The suspension used torsion bars up front and leaf springs in the rear like all Belvederes, but the GTX used heavy-duty components including a big front anti-sway bar, and that anti-sway bar made a big difference in these cars. It also had heavy-duty shocks. Muscle cars get a bad rep in the handling department, but as I've explained in the previous videos, that was largely due to comparisons using the more mundane versions of these cars. If you drive a base Belvedere, its handling is so poor it's almost criminal. However, with the uprated components used in the actual muscle cars, like the GTX, they handle quite well. The other factor that works against muscle cars was the US manufacturer's insistence on staying with bias ply tires long after the Europeans had switched over to radials. However, with equivalent tires, a GTX will handle right there with the big European sedans and be far faster in a straight line than any European car short of an exotic. Front disc brakes were optional, and as with the other muscle cars, they're vented, not the cheaper solid discs commonly used on the European sedans. In terms of muscle cars, in 1967 the GTX really was the performance king. The 440 was hard to beat with GM's 400 cubic inch limit. I'll talk about the Fords later. If the 440 wasn't enough, you could order the much more expensive but more powerful 426 Hemi. This was essentially a detuned racing engine. It gave you 425 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. However, that extra power cost you over $800, which was about one-fourth the price of the car, thus very few people selected that option. Not only did the 440 save you all that money, but it was nearly more powerful, it had more torque, and it was lighter. And while I wouldn't say it was easier to work on, I think the way I'll say this is that the typical mechanics of the time were more familiar with the 440. So the 440 was a very comfortable choice for the vast majority of GTX buyers. Now, I like the Plymouth GTX, I really do, and I just argued that it was the best muscle car for '67 in terms of performance. But the downside, and it's a big one, is that the car was junk as compared with the stuff from General Motors. The paint would fade almost immediately if it was exposed to the weather. The body would rust as fast as a Fiat. In defense of the Fiats, they were cheap and nobody cared, but the GTX was more of a mid-tier car. The upholstery held up okay, but everything else in the interior was of low quality, meaning the window winders, or if you had power windows, the window switches were cheap. The dash was a cheap-looking plastic piece. With the automatic transmissions, the floor-mounted shifter would feel crummy. It would be kind of loose in its mount almost immediately. I've never felt one that didn't feel that way. Then every 6 months to a year, you're going to be changing an alternator, water pump, or starter. The engine, transmission, suspension, and to a large extent the brakes were all top-notch, but everything else was substandard. Of course, today that doesn't really matter. Nobody uses these cars in such a way that you're worried about your kids wearing out the rear seat window winders. So a GTX is a great muscle car to own. But back in 1967, if you were using your muscle car as a daily driver or as a family car, as many people did, the GTX just might have been the worst choice possible. Please don't tell Uncle Tony I said this. Let's move on to the Pontiac. I would argue that the GTO started the muscle car trend in the 60s, and of course it's back for 1967. If the Plymouth GTX was your worst possible choice for a daily driver family car that did double duty as a drag racer on the weekend, then the 67 GTO may have been your best choice. As with all the other cars in this video, the GTO had minor styling changes for the 67 model year. Now, I'm not going to waste your time in this video going over every change to a trim piece or taillight. Just know that those changes are there. For 67, the GTO has some big improvements under the sheet metal over the 66 model. There's a new 400 cubic inch engine, and it's available in 3 different configurations. Finally, we have a good 3-speed automatic, and of course the dual master cylinder along with the disc brake option. As with the Chevelle, the GTO finally got a decent performance-oriented automatic, the Turbo Hydromatic 400, to back up the new engine. If you ordered it with a center console and a floor-mounted shifter, you got the Hurst dual-gate shifter. This was pretty special. It was a quality piece that had a second slot or gate which could be used when manually shifting the automatic. This prevented the user from accidentally shifting into neutral or reverse. If you left the car in drive, the transmission would perform full throttle shifts at the engine's 5,000 RPM redline. But if manually shifting, you could run it up a little higher, at some risk, of course. Remember, none of these cars had rev limiters. It was up to the driver to not blow things up. The new 3-speed automatic was not equal in performance to a manual 4-speed. The automatic could shift faster than a human. Shift speed wasn't the issue. But 3 gears versus 4, plus the automatic took more power to drive, thus less power reached the rear wheels. Still, at least for now, the GTO wasn't at a disadvantage against competing automatic cars from Dodge, Plymouth, or Ford. Of all the 1967 muscle cars, I think the GTO has the most appealing interior. That wood grain dash and Hurst shifter really set it apart from the others. And I can't stress enough that Hurst shifters were real quality parts. And in the GTO, manual or automatic, if it has a floor shifter, it was a Hurst shifter for 67. New for this year was the GTO's 400 cubic inch V8. It's not an all-new motor. You can think of it as last year's 389 with some real improvements. I think in 1966, so the previous year, the people at Pontiac had to know it was only a matter of time before their GTOs would be up against Plymouths and Dodges with the 440 engine. Even if they didn't hear that specifically in the Michigan rumor mill, I think they would have had to assume it because the 440 into those mid-sizes from Chrysler was such an easy fit. The thought of that had to be threatening to Pontiac. They were selling a lot of GTOs, so they had to keep it competitive with the 440. However, they couldn't just put in Pontiac's bigger 428, which would have done it, because there was a GM corporate limit of 400 cubic inches in intermediates. Plus, they had a limit of 1 horsepower per 10 pounds during many of the model years. And that limit was in place for all cars except the Corvette. Furthermore, Pontiac was going to have to meet these new challenges without its famous tri-power or 3 two-barrel carburetor setup. General Motors now forbid multiple carburetors on V8s except in the Corvette. Now that didn't include dealer installations, but no factory GM muscle car from 67 on had multiple carburetors. Pontiac took on this challenge with a multi-pronged attack. First, they legitimately made their engine more powerful. Second, they underrated the horsepower a little bit, at least as compared to the way they had been rating them before. And last, they used some marketing techniques which border on trickery. Trickery might be too strong of a word. You'll see what I mean later. The new 400-inch engine was essentially the old 389 with a larger bore, 60 thousandths of an inch or 1.5 millimeters larger. They kept the 389's 10.75 to 1 compression ratio, which was about all they could get away with. Remember, they had good high-octane leaded gasoline back then, but these engines had cast iron heads and no knock detection or protection, so for the time, that was a lot of compression. Pontiac reworked the cylinder heads as well. The new heads had new valve angles on the 4-barrel carbed 400s, and they had improved porting. They also put in some pretty large intake and exhaust valves. They're larger than those used in the Chevy 396 or even larger than those used in Plymouth's 440. So the new Pontiac 400 could really breathe. The base version put out 335 horsepower. That's the same amount as the previous year's 389. There's no question that the new 400 was more powerful than last year's engine, but these ratings were somewhat nebulous back then. Strangely, buyers could downgrade to a 255 horsepower version. It had lower compression, different heads, and a 2-barrel carb. I don't know how many people bought this option, but I think it was a bad idea. I understand that someone may have wanted the look of a GTO but didn't want to buy premium fuel. I get that. But if that's the case, if you wanted that look and you wanted to save on fuel cost, Pontiac already had a car for those buyers. In 1967, you could buy a Tempest Sprint. The Sprint had all of the appearance package stuff of a muscle car or a sporty car. It had the wheels, the stripes, the center console. You could even get the GTO's red inner fender liners on a Pontiac Sprint. Under the hood was an economical but high-performance 6-cylinder engine. These made either 207 or 215 horsepower depending on when you bought the car, which was a lot for a 6-cylinder back then. They could do a sub 10-second 0 to 60 time, which was quicker than most of the European sedans anywhere near the same price range, and the Pontiac 6-cylinder was pretty easy on gas. This was a true performance 6-cylinder with high compression, a 4-barrel carb, overhead camshaft, which was pretty unusual in American cars back then. It was a good car, but few people bought it. It didn't help that Pontiac advertised it as sort of a muscle car imposter. Back to the GTO. I don't know how many buyers opted for that 255 horsepower version. I'm sure some did. Some buyers upgraded though, from the base 335 horsepower engine to a 360 horsepower engine, which put the car right up against GM's corporate rule of 1 horsepower per 10 pounds. Compared with the 335 horse engine, the 360 horse mill has a bigger carburetor, a low restriction air cleaner, and a different camshaft, which was the big change. A 360 horse GTO was a fearsome competitor at the drag strip or in the stoplight Grand Prix. Now the top engine, and this is where I think there's a touch of marketing trickery, was the 400 cubic inch Ram Air engine. Pontiac enthusiasts would later call this Ram Air 1, but in '67 it was just the Ram Air 400. The Ram Air 400 was the real deal. This was not a sticker package or something. They took the hood scoop, they opened it up, sealed it to the air cleaner, making it functional. I don't have a '67 GTO sitting here to test, wish I did, but it looks to me like the scoop is too low and in the wrong place to give a really meaningful increase in air pressure via Ram Air. For comparison, a big scoop ideally located gives you around 1/10 of a PSI at 80 miles per hour. That's good for just under 1% more power. But I seriously doubt this scoop gives half that in terms of Ram air pressure. However, it would lower the air temperature at the carb, and that's good for around 10 horsepower, so this thing isn't doing nothing. Furthermore, the Ram Air engine came with a yet hotter camshaft and upgraded valve springs. Officially, none of this added any power. It was still rated at 360 horsepower, but it probably had 375, maybe a little bit more. But again, Pontiac was up against those GM corporate limitations. However, almost nobody bought this option. I think the reason is because it had to be paired with a 4.33 to 1 rear axle ratio. That's great for the quarter mile, but way too steep for any kind of normal usage. It's my feeling, and this is the trickery I was talking about earlier. Anyway, it's my feeling that Pontiac wanted to make sure that it was very rare for their top engine in a GTO to be beat in a drag race. Thus, if a 440 Plymouth or Dodge lined up against a Ram Air GTO at the drag strip, 90% of the time the GTO is going to have a gearing advantage with its 4.33 gears versus the typical 3.23 or 3.55 gears in the 440 powered cars. I really can't think of another reason you shouldn't be able to get the Ram Air engine with a more usable axle ratio. Those 4.33s are going to make highway travel functionally impossible. The GTO really did have it all though for 1967. It was a quality car. It has a great back seat, huge trunk, a very nice interior, and a lot of performance at a good price. If I had to pick the best muscle car for '67, I think I'm going to go with the GTO. There's another car later that's going to give it a heck of a run though. Next up, we have the Ford Fairlane GT and GTA. The GTA is the same car as the GT, but with the automatic transmission. That was Ford's excellent C6 transmission, by the way, 3-speed. The big change from 1966 was the dual master cylinder for the brakes and the new disc brake option. Of course, it's overall pretty much the same car as the previous year. The Fairlane had as standard equipment the 320 horsepower, 10.5 to 1 compression, 390 cubic inch V8. This was a good, reliable engine, but not in the same league as the Chevy 396, Pontiac 400, or Plymouth 440 in terms of power, and certainly not in terms of potential power easily unleashed in a weekend. They were certainly decent cars. I do like them, but they were not quite on the same level of as the cars from General Motors in terms of quality. They were higher quality, though, than the Plymouth GTX. Interestingly, you could get the 390 engine with a slightly milder camshaft in a Fairlane XL. So if you wanted a muscular Fairlane, but wanted a little bit smoother idle, didn't want the muscle car look or sound of the Fairlane GT, a Fairlane XL with a 390 was a good choice. There was also an optional 427 cubic inch engine, and with a single 4-barrel carb, this thing put out 410 horsepower. With dual 4 barrels, it put out 425. However, these were incredibly rare. The few Fairlanes that were built with 427s were usually bare-bones cars set up for drag racing, and a manual transmission was required with that engine. The 427 Fairlane is sort of analogous to the 426 Hemi Plymouth GTX. They existed, but very few people ordered them. Now, at least in the case of Plymouth's Hemi, everyone knew about it. You could order one. Plymouth advertised them, and you could get it if you wanted to spend the money. Few people did because the 440 was nearly as powerful, slightly more powerful at the low end, and much less expensive. In the case of the 427 Fairlane, it wasn't just a question of the extra cost, which was an extra $1,200. The 427 made the Hemi look like a cheap option. But beyond that, the 427 was very difficult to actually get. Only around 200 were built. I have never seen a Fairlane GT with a factory-installed 427. In fact, I haven't seen a Fairlane of any type in real life with a factory-installed 427. All the ones I can find on the internet are base models or XLs, not GTs. Ford made it clear that this was not an engine intended for passenger car use. Not only did they literally say that, but they limited the options on a car with the 427 in it in such a way that it wouldn't likely be a choice for daily use or family transportation. I've even heard that to buy a 427 Fairlane in '67, you had to know somebody at Ford, and that all of these cars were sold before they were built. This wasn't a car someone would cross-shop with a daily driver GTO. Although for drag racing purposes, if you could get a 427 Fairlane, it was going to give that Hemi GTX a heck of a good run. Back to the version that was intended to be cross-shopped with the GTO and the other muscle cars, the Fairlane GT or GTA would not perform right with a GTO or an SS396 or a Plymouth GTX, but it's a nice car. They sound great, they ride well, and they were powered by one of the most reliable engines of the 1960s. Those 390s ran forever. The Ford transmissions and rear ends were also nearly bulletproof. I'm not a fan of the Ford suspension. They use this weird coil spring configuration up front in which the coil spring itself would be mounted so high in the chassis that its suspension mounts would intrude pretty far into the engine compartment in such a way that it makes these cars kind of hard to work on. It also put highly stressed suspension points farther away from the subframe, which then required further bracing and strengthening. That said, it works and the cars handle okay, and with disc brakes they stop pretty well. And let's not forget that we saw in the 1966 episode of this series that with minor hot rodding techniques, those 390 Fairlanes could run right with the GM cars, drag strip or racetrack. Even stock off the showroom floor, all these muscle cars were close enough in performance that the individual options have more of an effect on quarter mile times than which car you bought. As an example, in the quarter mile, a Fairlane GT, which would have a 4-speed, if combined with 411 gears, would easily beat a Chevy SS396 with the 325 horse engine, an automatic, and 273 gears. So while apples to apples, the Ford may have been the slower car, a lot really depends on just how these cars were optioned, and also on just what sort of speed contest you're looking at. I really do like the Fairlane GT and GTA. The overall quality of the car was pretty good. I like the way they look, and the performance was decent. It wasn't very absolutely top-notch, but it was decent. Moving on, if Plymouth was aimed right at Chevrolet, Chrysler Corporation was pointing their Dodge division at Pontiac. Their coronet was aimed right at the Pontiac Le Mans. In mechanical terms, the coronet can be thought of as Dodge's version of the Plymouth Belvedere. Like the Belvedere, the coronet could be optioned with a pretty hot 383 4-barrel and manual transmissions. There were various models of the coronet, including one called the Coronet 440, which does not have the 440 engine. That's just the name of the car, which is a bit confusing sometimes. The Dodge muscle car for 67 was the Coronet RT, and it did have the 440 engine as standard equipment. RT stood for road and track, and when you saw that badge on a Dodge in the 1960s, it meant the car was equipped with a serious performance package, including a powerful engine, a strong transmission, along with upgraded suspension and brakes. This was not just an appearance package. The Coronet RT rides on what is essentially the same chassis as the Plymouth GTX. It's largely the same car. The difference is that the Dodge has a wheelbase 1 inch longer, which translates into just a touch more interior room, and I feel it improves the ride and stability of the car. The interior is slightly more upscale than the Plymouth. Under the sheet metal, the RT and GTX are pretty much the same car. Both cars use the same 375 horsepower 440 as standard equipment, and both offer the same transmission choices. I wouldn't say they're exactly the same car, as they had different bodies and wheelbases, but they're quite similar. As with the GTX, you could of course option a Coronet RT with the 426 Hemi, but for the same reasons as with the GTX, very few people did. In addition to the Coronet RT, Dodge also had the Charger. Riding on the same chassis as the Coronet, you could order the Charger with the 335 horse 383 or the 375 horse 440, and of course the 425 horse 426 Hemi, so they did offer some pretty powerful engines in this car. Dodge didn't quite have the marketing for the Charger figured out for 67. It seemed to be lined up more as a competitor to premium luxury coupes like the Pontiac Grand Prix, Buick Riviera, and Ford Thunderbird, rather than lining it up against muscle cars like the GTO or Fairlane GTA. In terms of performance, a Charger with the 440 is about identical to a Coronet RT or Plymouth GTX, as all three are mechanically almost the same car. I won't spend much more time on the Charger because I covered it very thoroughly in my 1966 episode, and the only significant changes for 67 were the dual master cylinder, optional disc brakes, and of course the 440 engine. But that engine was a game changer for the Charger. The previous year, there was too much of a performance gap and a price gap between the 383 and the 426 Hemi. Now, Charger buyers could get an engine with more power than the 383 and more power than the competition without breaking the bank. Next up, we have the Oldsmobile 442. This car has the same two changes nearly all GM muscle cars had for 67. Dual master cylinder and optional disc brakes. Oh, and of course the 3-speed automatic transmission. The engine was still Oldsmobile's 400 cubic inch V8 with 350 horsepower. There was a dealer installed option which allowed a hotter cam and a slightly different air cleaner assembly along with a ram air configuration. It was still rated at 350 horsepower, but at a slightly higher point in the RPM range, and reality is that it probably had at least 10 more horsepower than the non-ram air variant. If I had to bet money and had these cars in my shop and put them on the dyno, I'd bet it's probably closer to 20 more horsepower. In my opinion, the 442 may have been the best muscle car of 67. I know earlier I was leaning hard towards the GTO, but this is a really tough call. The Olds was a more expensive and more upscale car, but without sacrificing any performance. Then again, to me, the 442 just doesn't quite have the muscle car look. I realize that's entirely subjective. In any case, it was a very good car, and it had better handling than the GTO due to its rear anti-sway bar, and nearly identical quarter-mile performance. On the plus side for the Olds, you could get the ram air option with whatever gear ratios you wanted. so that's a big plus as compared with the GTO. You could also get the Olds with a 4-speed manual and a Hurst shifter, although there was no close ratio option. So for pure performance, I gotta lean a little bit more towards the GTO there. The 442 for 67 was truly a great car. If I was buying a new muscle car in 67, it would have really been a tough choice between this and the GTO. Along the lines of cars that didn't change much for 67, we have the Mercury Cyclone GT and GTA. Both feature the same 320 horse 390 found in the fairlane, and the Cyclone is essentially the same car. Ford's Mercury division was slightly more upscale than Ford, so the Cyclone was a bit more expensive, a little bit nicer, but in terms of performance, it's functionally identical to the fairlane. The only major new items for 67 were the dual master cylinder and front disc brakes. On the Cyclone GT and GTA, front disc brakes were standard, which was really nice. The Cyclones didn't sell well. These were rare cars. Now, in terms of performance, they were at the back of the pack, but not by much. On the upside, they were rock-solid, reliable cars and overall nice cars, and I really like the way they look. Plus, the rarity of the Cyclone gives it an appeal all its own. Last but not least, we have the Buick GS400. Note there was also a GS340, which was a sort of junior muscle car. That was a subcategory. Actually, I'm making up that term, junior muscle car. But consider that a subcategory intended to provide buyers with a near muscle car experience without the skyrocketing insurance rates. Of course, it's the GS400, the big dog, we're focused on right now. Junior muscle cars would be another video entirely. The GS400 for 67 was significantly different from the 1966 model. In fact, this might be the most changed muscle car for 67. Of course, we have the normal types of model year appearance changes, new grille, hood, and so on. But the big news was under the hood. The car had an all-new engine, which was Buick's new 400 cubic inch V8, which replaced the previous 401. That was the old nailhead engine, the 401. Official power numbers were about the same. The old 401, when equipped with the optional Rochester carb, put out 340 horsepower. The new 400 was also rated at 340 horsepower. However, the new engine was a much more modern design. It was lighter and it had far better breathing. Now, for the first time, Buick's muscle car was on an even footing with the Pontiac and Oldsmobile, meaning that if all three cars had their base engines, wide ratio 4-speeds, and normal use gearing, they're all about the same in terms of acceleration. Of course, for 67, Buick gained the brake improvements seen in the other GM muscle cars, along with a 3-speed automatic transmission, replacing the older 2-speed. In fact, for 67 only, the Buick GS400's 3-speed automatic had a variable pitch stator in the torque converter, which was unusual. Side note, the model on the hood is Jean Shrimpton. She was one of the first supermodels and was largely responsible for popularizing the miniskirt, so thanks to her for that. And she also represented the changes from the more voluptuous look of the 1940s and 50s models to the more slim look that continues in fashion models to this day. Back to cars, we lack the same amount of magazine data for 67 than we had for 66. The new pony cars, meaning the Mustang and its imitators, were stealing all the magazine thunder in 1967. There was quite a bit going on there. The new Mustang could accept Ford's big 390. Chevy came out with the Camaro. Pontiac came out with the Firebird, both of which could be optioned with big, powerful engines, essentially the same engines that could be had in the Chevelle SS 396 and GTO. Plymouth was hitting that market hard, with legitimate performance options for its restyled Barracuda. Now, these performance cars were not quite the same things as muscle cars, and in spite of, in some cases, having the same engines, generally they didn't have quite the same levels of performance for reasons I'll get into in another episode. But the lines between muscle cars and pony cars were starting to be blurred in 1967. What I'm getting at here is that the muscle cars in 67 were a bit overlooked in the automotive press, so I'm going to have to give you quarter-mile data here that's a combination of what little specific 67 data we have, plus data from similar configurations from other years. which in the case of Ford, Mercury, and Oldsmobile are almost identical to the 1966 cars, and of course data from my own personal experience. In terms of quarter-mile performance, all the GM cars were right in the same ballpark, with the higher power options, meaning a GS400, a 360 horse GTO, SS396, or Ram Air Olds. All these cars would run 14.1 to 14.4 with a 4-speed transmission and rear gears in the 3.5 to 1 range. With automatics, the cars would usually run in the high 14s. I can't stress enough that gearing is the biggest variable here, bigger than the actual car. The 390 Fairlane and Comet were in the low 15s with automatics and high 14s with manuals, again with around 3.5 to 1 gearing. The Plymouths and Dodges had the edge at the drag strip. With automatics and relatively tall 3.23 gears, these things would run 14.4s all day long. If using manual transmissions and 355 or lower gears, meaning higher numerically, they could run in the high 13s, and Hemi cars could get into the mid 13s. Actually getting these times, though, out of any of these cars took a huge amount of skill. It's hard to explain to some of our younger drivers who haven't ever driven a really powerful car on bias ply tires with no traction control. Just a little bit too much power at the start, and those tires go up in smoke, and your 14.1 second quarter mile run turns into a 16-second run, and that's not an exaggeration. It's that delicate of an operation, which is part of the reason that if you're in the market for a muscle car, dwelling on a few tenths of a second in the published quarter mile times really isn't worth the effort. Buy the car you like the best. For me, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, it's the Plymouth GTX. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, I encourage you to watch the others in this series. I have links to them in the description and pinned in the comments. My muscle car videos don't get a lot of views, so I appreciate every view they do get, and of course I read and appreciate all of the comments. That's all for now. Have a great day.